Fellowship of the Broken, Making Sense of 12-Step Recovery by Angelo. Chapter 25, Nihilism. This may seem a strange subject to raise at this point. My own experience and my involvement in working with others suggests that this is a topic that's better discussed than disregarded without comment. The greatest peril in spiritual growth is the potential for a gap in time between letting go of the personal ego self and becoming safely established in non-personal consciousness. This gap can give rise to feelings of being lost, of doubt, depression, and despair. It's known colloquially as the dark night of the soul, which relates to a poem by the 16th century Spanish mystic St. John of the Cross. A useful metaphor in this respect is the parable of Jonah and the whale. In this story, Jonah is guided to travel to Nineveh to carry the message of wisdom. However, Jonah was not too keen on this idea because the residents of Nineveh were enemies of his people. He decided to travel by sea in the opposite direction. The ship ran into a big storm, and the crew blamed Jonah for this predicament and decided to throw him overboard. At this low point, Jonah's day got even worse when a giant fish promptly swallowed him. He spent 3 fearful and dark days and nights in the belly of the fish, praying for help and admitting that his personal thinking had gone against the guidance he had received. He also prayed with gratitude that he had been saved from drowning. This repentance and thanksgiving finally resulted in him being thrown up onto the shores of Nineveh. Jonah then acted against his own personal wishes and followed the previous guidance to share wisdom with the people he disliked. He expected them to ignore him, and he was rather hoping that they would ignore him and therefore suffer the consequences. After speaking with them, he sat in the shade under a plant and waited to see what would happen. The wisdom was, however, received and understood. No harm came to the Ninevites, and Jonah consequently became bitter and angry. A worm then destroyed his shady plant, and Jonah was left in the scorching heat, complaining and wanting to die. Despite having been saved from drowning, saved from the whale, and given the chance to help others, he still ended up allowing his negative personal motives to overshadow all of the goodness. The story ends at this point, and Jonah's subsequent fate is left open-ended. Such parables are open to interpretation, of course, but our model of consciousness provides a clear understanding. First of all, Jonah ignores the guidance of knowing and follows the agenda of the personal ego mind rather than universal mind. He heads in the opposite direction, and eventually life conspires to throw him into the sea of suffering. He's saved from drowning by spirit and ends up in a place that he perceives to be dark and frightening. In his despair he prays for help, and this leads to him being placed exactly where he is supposed to be. Secondly, he then has the opportunity to learn from his experience and help others. However, he does this reluctantly, and his personal motives remain negative. Things do not turn out as he wishes. Life conspires against him again, and he is left once more in a state of suffering and wanting to die. He has been given every opportunity to understand, yet he remains firmly attached to his personal identity and fails to see the wisdom that his life circumstances are revealing to him. The story is left open-ended because it's not known when his particular dark night of the soul will come to an end. He may continue to resist the guidance of universal mind, or he may come to understand the true nature of reality. He may finally surrender his personal self-centered agenda in favor of an individual experience of non-personal consciousness. Well, there's no right or wrong answer. The choice is his, but the implications are crystal clear. Such a metaphorical experience is by no means unusual and in many ways is inevitable. We each have a personal investment in the ego self, and this believed identity defines and shapes our lives. The very thought of letting go of this belief can give rise to self-centered fear, and the actual act of surrender can lead to feelings very similar to grief. There's also often a period of struggle, where the ego mind wants to return to familiar and comfortable ground, whereas universal mind is leading us away from it. This happens even when the familiar and comfortable state is one of suffering. Many well-known spiritual teachers throughout the ages have been through these battles and doubts. There's actually nothing wrong, yet it can feel as though our whole lives are falling apart. We reach a point where we fear going back to our old ways and also fear moving ahead towards an uncertain future. This is not a comfortable or enjoyable phase, but the good news is that it does not last. It is the equivalent of a caterpillar going through the process of metamorphosis in its chrysalis. It is temporarily neither caterpillar nor butterfly, and it is a period of darkness and reconstruction. The butterfly will eventually emerge, but it does take time. The important thing here is not to lose faith in the process. The desired result will come if we allow the unfolding to take place. A big problem arises at this stage if we are still totally reliant on personal mind. Depression, despair and grief are powerful feelings, and the ego mind will want to make these feelings go away. Doubt may creep into our thinking, and this will undermine faith. We will be strongly tempted to return to our old coping strategies, and for an addict this spells danger. We will either relapse or we will remain abstinent yet trapped in a position where we cannot go back but fear going forward. We cannot live with active addiction and we cannot live without it. In such circumstances, the ego mind can turn to self-destructive thoughts. In my experience, there is a high prevalence of suicidal thoughts and suicide attempts amongst addicts, and these can occur in active addiction or during abstinence. And some of these attempts are, unfortunately, successful. Strong personal identity with the body and mind means that the only apparent option left for the ego self to relieve suffering is to bring the experience of life to a premature end. There is logic here, but such thinking is clearly self-centered and fails to take account of the traumatic impact this has on family and friends. And it's also based on a fundamental understanding of who we really are. I'm not suggesting that the experience of suffering is unreal or inconsequential, but it's clear that suffering arises due to the mistaken personal self-identity. Suffering is inevitable and necessary in order for the ego mind to return to universal mind, but sometimes ego mind remains unconvinced and brings the journey to a precipitous end. The whirlpool returns to the river and the journey begins again downstream. Another danger can arise when mind begins to grasp the idea of non-dual consciousness, but identity remains firmly with the personal self. In these circumstances, we are vulnerable to nihilistic thinking, because we may come to believe that the world has no real existence, and hence conclude that there's no point in continuing to suffer. And this may also lead to suicidal thoughts. Again, there's logic in this thinking, but it arises in the personal ego mind. Such thinking comes from an intellectual grasp of non-duality without subsequent spiritual practice. The personal ego mind cannot understand, yet an unshakable belief in personal identity can convince the assumed self that it does understand. There's no wisdom in nihilism. It's just another trap caused by an ego mind that does not want to give up the illusory right to self-governance. It may be informed ignorance, but it's still ignorance nonetheless. The key to overcoming these pitfalls is the continuing practice of self-awareness, self-contemplation, and self-forgetting. If we can be aware of how the conditioned ego mind is operating, and contemplate who it is that is having these nihilistic, self-destructive thoughts, then we gain the confidence to forget about our self-centered thinking and instead focus on allowing the dark night of the soul to pass. The dawn of awakening will come soon enough as the balance of power shifts from human to being.